The Mark Thompson Show.
It is a thrill to welcome someone to this mix who can really break down economics and finance and has operated at the highest levels. You know this guy from CNBC, from MSNBC, from Bloomberg. He has traveled the world as an investor, as an entrepreneur. He has a podcast called Truth or Skepticism from Tasty Live. Never have I met someone who understands the complexities of economics and the banking systems worldwide, who can bring them to life and break them down in some sort of palatable way, as I have this guy. Best-selling author and so generous to be with us right now, Dylan Ratigan, everybody. Yeah. Hey, Dylan Ratigan.
How are you, sir?
I'm so well, and I am really lucky to be able to bring you to my audience because I think you can break down some of what's going on. All of our heads were whipped around with the SVB intervention that was required by the FDIC and the way they intervened and the way there was a run on that bank. And then the ripple effect and the anxiety that ran through the banking system. And as we were reading, the banking system was essentially fine, but everybody was just nervous. Now I'm not so sure that's right. We've seen foreign banks succumb to what would seem to be some of the same things we've seen with domestic banks here in the U.S. I wonder if you could take us back to this SVB thing one more time and tell us what happened. The latest news out of SVB comes in Senate Banking Committee testimony, which essentially suggests that there was going to be an even bigger run on the bank and the bank's assets had another day gone by, had that Monday rolled around without the FDIC working out a deal. I wonder if you can take us back to that and then explain how this ripple effect actually affects banking worldwide.
Yeah. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've been really enjoyed my time getting to know you in recent days and weeks, and it's an honor to be with you. So I'm pleased to be here. I think you have to understand how banks make money before you can even, or else it doesn't make any sense. And banks really only have two choices. They can either extend loans and credit and investment to people with worse credit, basically make more money, get a higher interest rate for riskier loans, or they can make lower risk loans that don't pay back for a long time. So they only have two ways to make money. So they can either add duration, which is I'm going to loan money for a long time in order to get a higher interest rate, or they can reduce credit quality, increase risk, and give riskier loans. So everybody's familiar with 2008 and 9. That was obviously riskier loans throughout the system. So the compensation in banking since then was to add duration, right? Instead of making money through adding credit, like adding riskier credit, they decided to make money by adding longer dated loans. And so, and just understand a little bit more piece of background, because if you don't understand this, you don't understand anything. In order to solve the problem in 2008 and 9, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates to 0% for 10 years. So because of the credit issues in 2008 and 9, there was a decade where banks could borrow money and people in general could borrow money for less than 3%, and banks could borrow it for 0%. And then in the fastest time ever, the central bank went from 0% to 5%.
So what happens to those? Yeah, what happens to those?
That's why there's stress in the system.
Okay.
So because these banks have lent money for long periods of time, they're planning to borrow money cheaper than they're lending it. So they're borrowing money at 0 and they're lending it at 2.5 or 3.5 or numbers like this. And all of a sudden they have all these long dated loans, mortgages and whatnot, that are 2.5%, 3% interest. But instead of paying 0% to borrow money to lend, they're now being charged 5%. And they're doing it on huge amounts of money. So any small movement creates massive gains and massive, massive losses. So this is relevant for two reasons. One, you have to understand, how did the banks get into the situation they're in right now? They did it by extending credit over long periods of time on the expectation that Federal Reserve would leave rates 0 or be very slow to raise them. They were wrong, and they didn't protect themselves, which is bad management by those banks.
How do they protect themselves, Dylan?
There's a litany of derivatives, just different hedging.
Insurance, essentially, against that.
The insurance rate is insurance on interest rates rising.
Okay.
Which reduces their returns.
Because it costs money.
So instead of making 2%, they make, they got to buy the insurance. But that way, if this does flip over on them, and there's plenty of banks where this did flip over who did have insurance, M&T Bank has other ones that are fine. So that's why this happened. But the reason that this is so significant is back in the financial crisis, the government created two types of banks. The big four, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. And those four were deemed to be what's called systemically significant institutions, which means that they were legally too big to fail. And that anything that happens at those four banks will always be bailed out. And that was made law in 2000 and whatever, 10 or something, whenever they passed that law, 11. What they did with Silicon Valley Bank was they treated Silicon Valley Bank like a systemically significant bank and bailed out the whole bank. They ignored the whole FDIC insurance at $250,000. And so when they did that, they put themselves, the government, in a situation where implicitly they actually have to bail out every depositor ever. Can you imagine if they bail out Silicon Valley Bank and then the People's Bank of Detroit that has a bunch of black small business owners isn't at risk and the government doesn't help them? There'll be a revolution, and there should be. And so the point is that the Silicon Valley Bank bailout was a change in national policy to implicitly guarantee all bank deposits in an unlimited fashion.
But that's impossible, isn't it? I mean, the reserves aren't significant enough.
No, it's possible because the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency.
I see.
There's an unlimited supply. Now, every time we do that, it's financial terrorism on the rest of the world because it raises the cost of grain and basic commodities. So it increases starvation in other places that are not here, but it solves our problems.
And just to stop you there, because there's more of those dollars you're saying in the world now, because you've had to print up so many to bail out these various institutions, and so that makes the value of those dollars a little less because there's so many more.
And that value, that decrease in the value of the dollar is first seen in the price of basic commodities like wheat and corn. So you don't see it in. Now we're seeing inflation everywhere, but it first appears in basic commodities. So the poorest people in the world that are on the edge anyway are the ones that suffer the most because for them, it's the difference between a loaf of bread or not a loaf of bread. When you think back to the revolution in Tahrir Square, that was preceded by massive food inflation from the money printing of the financial crisis in America. So that the Tahrir Square was, in my opinion, and it was a contributing factor empirically. In my opinion, it was causal because I think when you take people's food away is when they're willing to go outside and become very reckless and aggressive, and understandably so. So my point is that they changed policy now to guarantee all the bank deposits, and in the trade-off for that is to basically kick the can on the issue of the banks into the future towards weakened currency and inflation. But the reason it's so horrifying is you're allowing the CEOs and board members of these banks to pay themselves tens of millions of dollars a year and walk around like masters of the universe, but they actually are simply using the taxpayer to do business. So once the government guarantees all the deposits, you're basically nationalizing the banks, but doing it in a way that's worse than a nationalization because you're allowing private executives to collect all of the compensation and transfer all of the risk to the U.S. taxpayer. And the reason Silicon Valley Bank is so alarming is because it made the too big to fail policy, the moral hazard of bank risk, apply to every bank, not just the big four. Because
that was implicit in their decision, is your point.
Yeah, whatever they say, the moment they said we will insure all of the deposits at SVB, they were by definition insuring all of the deposits at any bank in America and every bank in America.
So, question quickly, if they had not then interceded, if they had not then bailed them out, they'd not made a deal with FDIC funds, would that have been a better move? And what would have happened?
No. So the reason the banks have so much leverage is because they are the lifeline of all economic activity in the country. And so they're like a terrorist. So when they get into trouble, they say, listen, I know you don't want to bail me out, but if you don't bail me out, everybody's going to lose their job. Nobody's going to make payroll, dogs, cats, all these horrible things.
Right.
And so it's not about bailing them out or not bailing them out. It's about the terms of the bailouts need to come with a change of control. So if you're going to come to me and say, bail me out and pay for everything, I say, fine, but I now control governance. You are now disqualified from making decisions. And instead, what happens is they do the bailout, and then they allow the same people who created the problem to retain all of the money that they paid themselves in the 10 years prior to creating the problem. And they allow them to continue inside the system, which is why I think you see such an inflamed sense of frustration from the deep left and the deep right. Because even if they don't understand the detail of this discussion, they know something effed up is happening, and it's very animating for people.
So, and your point about the presumption of the economics, the underlying economics, is that something does have to be done. I mean, these are important institutions that you have to keep. Yeah,
you have no choice but to bail them out, but you need to use the bailout moment, which is a point of great leverage, to do things like transfer governance and assign liens to future earnings that then recover
some
money.
of that bailout money. Yeah. Question then about what we saw happening in overseas banks. Was that the same thing? It didn't feel like a run on the bank the way we had seen SVB or even some of these other banking institutions in this country. What's happening throughout the banking system all of a sudden?
Again, and you actually brought up this point to me last week. You have an issue with the liquidity. So a bank account historically has been thought of as something, in commercial terms, it's called sticky, and that people who have banking relationships are very sticky. Primarily, meaning they don't, once you're in operation, managing a flow of payments, a mortgage, a checking account, whatever it is, there's a lot of resistance to close that account and open new accounts because it's a pain in the neck, it's disruptive, all these things. With the advent of the fintech and digital banking, whether it's a legacy bank or a modern newco of some kind, the ease with which money can accumulate or dissipate around any one company is at a velocity that is without precedent. And so you have multiple factors happening at the same time. So to think of it like if there's I don't know, I don't want to give you something too disgusting, but like a bunch of rats are discovered in a crowded at a big party.
Sure.
That's alarming for the people that see the rats, and that would be the interest rate problem for the banks. But then as word gets around that there's rats at the party, the behavior of the people that don't even ever see the rats in terms of their desire to leave, the car accidents, people racing. So,
Right.
so this is the same thing where the initial issue creates aftershock in human behavior, which are now easy to act on an impulsive basis, which makes much more velocity to asset dissipation. And then as assets dissipate from institutions, it makes the problem, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so on the one hand, you have the real economic issue, then you're surrounded by a bunch of crazy cats that'll run on the first sign of trouble, they're running for the door, clawing each other's eyes out. And then in Europe, you had Credit Suisse specifically, which has been a financially troubled bank for 10 years, 5 years at least, basically come into the stress of everything that I was just describing, and especially in terms of the exodus and the stock price. And it took a bank that's been around since the mid 1800s and ended it, a week or two ago. That bank was probably going to go anyway. And so this is more like, it's sort of, this is the weak in the herd in this case. They were already weak. But the issue is, as each one happens, this is the same thing as one bank. So if each bank has debits, and credits to other banks. And so as each bank fails, they then create problems for other banks, which is the domino issue that they were really worried about in 08, 09, and which is they're also really worried about right now, but they just don't want to talk about it. And so the only way to intervene on the domino is for the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to do a blanket insurance on all the money, which is what they did in 09. They said there is no amount of money. We have all the money. And that's basically what they've done more quietly here, implicitly because of what they did for Silicon Valley Bank. The entire process is alarming primarily because the elephant in the room is if you're going to allow bankers to take risk and accept massive compensation packages, they must be held accountable for their losses, right? Which is okay. That's let them fail, but let them fail is a self-destructive act.
Sure.
For all of us that would say let them fail morally, because they have this terrorist leverage of everybody else fails if we fail. But you can separate the banks and the function of the banks from the bankers. And what America has refused to do in 2008, 9, 10, and what it's refusing to do now is to separate the banks from the bankers.
Is that because the bankers are so mobbed up with legislators with is it essentially regulatory creep, that you see across government?
For sure that's true. I would say you have two things. One, everything you just said, the banks control Washington. But in addition to that, the ethos, the mythology of the United States is so loyal to the mythology of the independent private sector, creative entrepreneur, Thomas Edison, Elon Musk, Henry Ford, Teddy Roosevelt, the sovereign creator. And we all love that. It's very appealing. It's the ethos of our culture. And it's why this country has so many great things, by the way, that culture has many great aspects. But in this case, that culture is being exploited by the bankers to suggest that if they are held to account in a way that the bank is funded, the depositors are funded, but they lose their ownership of both the bank right now and all future earnings, that in some way is a betrayal of capitalism. And that's a lie. That's an objective lie, because capitalism, risk resides with the risk taker, and thus the reward resides with the risk taker. In this case, the risk resides with the taxpayer, but the rewards reside with the banker. And whereas when risk is with the risk taker, risk is managed, because if it's your business and you're on the hook, you're paying a lot of attention. When I flip it, the incentive is not just different, it's the exact opposite. Because now the incentive is to get as much risk as humanly possible, because the more risk you add, the more money you make. And no matter how much risk you create, you're going to transfer it anyway. So whether it's Silicon Valley Bank doing long duration lending and crypto with no hedging, or whether it was Countrywide Financial doing ninja no income loans in Vegas, it's the same motive, which is maximize the profit potential of the bank and don't worry about the size of the risk pool, because if the cows come home, you can call the big man in DC and he'll take care of it, and he'll let us keep all the money.
Dylan, this is
which is alarming.
I'll be screamed out of the room for this, but let me ask the question anyway. What would happen, and we just have another minute or two, and this is maybe a question to put off for the next time, but nonetheless, let me just press ahead and ask you, what would happen if the banks in this country were taken over in some measure by the U.S. government? So they were no longer private institutions.
Sure. I mean, you would do it you would create a what would amount to be a bank resolution trust company. So the first thing you'd have to do is anesthetize the patient. So you would institute direct lending, which we already proved we can do in the pandemic, so that the money flows through the banks and from the federal. So everything moves. The first thing is you can't have a disruption in the flow of payments, payroll, or risk to deposits. So that's the anesthesia, which is the Federal Reserve and direct lending. And at that point, then a bank resolution trust company that is an agent of the government comes through and does clawbacks on the compensation for the banks that took the bailout, so that the prior compensation is repaid for the board members and the CEO, because they're in charge of risk aperture. and then you organize new management and a new company, which has a first lien, or its first debt holder is the government. So future earnings are paid back through that first lien, and then the company would have an IPO. And then you would take that from the government and just issue a new IPO. So whatever XYZ bank would go into the bailout, they would go to Bank Resolution Trust. There'd be a process for the board and the CEO, direct lending, to intervene, and then a new ownership structure organized in an IPO.
And lastly, will they ever claw that money back? You mentioned
Never,
the clawback.
Billion. So the issue with the clawback is the logical thing, right? Because the money's being stolen. The reason it's such an elegant theft is you pay yourself in the 10 years before the crime is revealed.
I see. Yeah.
And then when the crime is revealed, you're like, what are you going to do? At least I got my 50 million the last few years. But the reason that no one will go near the clawbacks is because everybody, myself included, no one wants to be subject to a clawback. And the issue with a clawback is that it punishes the children and the wives and the mothers. You end up penalizing people that are not the banker, that are 80 years old, and it's some unrelated granny or daughter or whatever. And the ruthless would say, listen, stolen money is stolen money, not my problem. And I think there's probably the truth somewhere in between. But the reason clawbacks will never happen is because it's the one thing nobody wants to have happen to them. So nobody wants to press it for anybody else.
Wow. This has been a great first primer. I want more. If we could, I'd love to make, it would be great, man. I would really look forward to the next visit. So thanks,
Anytime.
Dylan.
All right.
Dylan Ratigan, everybody. Dylan Ratigan. Love it. Thanks, Dylan.
All right. See ya.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.